What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over how we can upgrade our inventory system and our attachment system in our action RPG and third-person tutorial series. Specifically what we're upgrading today is our equipping and attachment logic. So we were able to open our inventory, add things to it, and use them or unselect them. And this is working well. We could then also pick up, say, the chest plate and put that on as well, and we'd have the sword and the chest plate together. But one thing that wasn't always working is that if we had an object that we were overlapping, say this helmet, and we already had objects on us, we had the chest plate and the sword, if we went to pick this up, sometimes this would bug out and you would not pick up the helmet. Instead, you might see another sword or another chest plate in your inventory. You're like, what the heck happened? And this is because our old inventory and interaction logic only focused one item at a time. And so even though we disabled things like our pickup collider so that we couldn't pick up the sword again, say if it was attached, we were still overlapping that same object. So as I was holding these different objects, like right now I'm overlapping the helmet technically. Sure, it's attached to my mesh, but that also counts as overlapping because we can only overlap one object at the current time. And so if I go to my dagger, then this is a second object being overlapped. So sometimes the interaction could fail here. Alright, and so now we have the ability to go around with all of our stuff on, our different armor and weapons, and go to an item and equip it, or interact with it. And then you can see that it is added to the inventory and we can equip it like normal. So basically we're getting rid of any of that weird logic where our system only supported one overlapped item. Okay, so this is going to make it a lot cleaner, and it's going to make our game function basically perfectly for equipping items when they're one at a time. There is still technically a bit of an issue if two items are directly over top of each other. Not so much an issue that it doesn't function properly, but we don't have a way to display these texts different. So you can see right now I'm over top of a dagger and an axe, and so if I get it in the right spot where I'm hovering both of them at the same time, ready? There we go. Then you can see I have both text overlaying on top of each other. I'm going to have to make a new widget for this, and also change the logic a bit in case we want to choose which one we want to pick up and not just pick it up based on the interaction button. But that'll be covered in another episode. So that's the only thing right now that will not be functional after this episode, is multiple objects on top of each other or within the same overlap in which one we actually equip. Alright. If you'd like to get caught up in the series, we're on episode 36 of the Action RPG tutorial series, so I'll leave this icon in the top right corner right here, which links you to the entire third-person tutorial playlist. That way you can check out everything we've done to get to this point. Alternatively, if you just care about inventory, I'll link to this episode right here, which is the first episode of the inventory system that we've used and that we're continuing to expand upon and make better in this series. And with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So almost everything is going to be in our base character BP today. We're going to do some stuff in the code as well, but it's mainly going to be cleanup and adjusting for better functionality and better performance. The main logic is going to be in the base character BP. And so right now it's really ugly, because I've been doing this thing lately in the series where I leave the old logic of blueprints and then I show you the new logic that I have and we clean it up in the episode. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go to our input action interact, and I'm going to show you what I had and what I have now. So input action interact. This is an input action in our project settings. This is my E key. Interact. And so if I press E on the keyboard, I trigger this event. Alright. We never set this up in code. This is blueprint only right now. And so on the base character BP, which is my assassin character, if I press the E key, it's going to trigger this function. And then we are going to go into this logic, and we were checking if we're overlapping an item before we did anything else. Now, we don't really need to be doing this because we were getting all overlapping actors. However, if we weren't overlapping any item and we called get overlapping actors with index 0, then this index actually wouldn't exist because it would be empty. There wouldn't be a 0 index in this array. So, whether or not we need this Boolean logically, we were using it to stop from accessing an index in this array that we did not have. Alright, so we were getting overlapping actors, and we were getting index 0 specifically, and then we were casting that to default item. Well, I've changed this now, because if we do this, this will only allow us to use one actor ever. Remember, that's the issue that we were just talking about. If we only get the first index of the overlapping actors, say we're overlapping a dagger and an axe, then it'll only ever grab index 0. Well, we really don't want that. We want to go through all of them. So instead what I've done is I've disconnected this get 0. In fact, I'm going to delete it now that you see. And instead of going to 0, I go ahead and I drag off the overlapping actors and type for each loop with break. Okay, so this is what we're doing now. Now let me clean this up a little bit. Make this a little bit better for everyone. Okay, and so now we interact, we see if we're overlapping an item or not, and then we loop through all of the actors that we're overlapping. This is already way better because we want to make sure that we go through all of our possible interactions, not just one at a time. All right, next thing. Now, we have for each loop with break here. And what we were doing before is we had the get 0 index, and we were passing that into a cast default item. It's okay to still cast to a default item, but we don't want to do it off that specific index. We want to do it off of every array element in this for each loop. Understand, get overlapping actors is not something we wrote. It's an Unreal built function, and any overlapping collisions with this character will go ahead and be returned in this array. So say we're overlapping things like a door, an AI, trigger, point, a visual effect of some sort. We don't want to try and add these things to our inventory. That's just broken logic. So we do want to make sure we can cast it to a proper type. Feel free to use a class filter and do something like default item in here. You'll still have to cast, however, it will make this function, this get overlapping actors, better for performance. Now the only problem with this is if you do this, you won't be able to check for overlapping things, say like doors. If you want to interact with doors to open them, and you have a section where you have to overlap and then press the interact key to open them or close them, this would not pick up on that, so you would have to do a separate for loop. However, that's actually perfectly fine. We can definitely handle this logic differently depending on the item we're overlapping, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. I'm actually going to put the class filter here just so this is a little bit cleaner. Alright. Okay, so looking at this again. Now we're checking all the default items that we're overlapping with, and we're looping through them. For each one of them, we now have to do the add to inventory logic. Alright? And so, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cast our array element to the default item. Again, even though we have the class filter here, when you get an array of this, so say I get copy, the return value is an actor object reference. It doesn't return the default item. Alright, it's going to return a normal array of actors. So you're still going to have to cast it to the default item type like we were doing no matter what. Now, in the previous episodes, I was adding the inventory here, but this is bad because this is where we were running into trouble where if you had the sword equipped, okay, let's say I go equip my sword, and then I go over to my helmet, and I equip my helmet. Now, I have these objects that I'm overlapping, right? I'm overlapping my sword and my helmet, and now this chest plate. If I go to interact with the chest plate, it works in this case, but before what it would do is that it would actually take the sword or the helmet and add it to the inventory again if index 0 from this overlapping actors was one of the objects we already had. And that's not what we want. So we don't want to add it to inventory right here, actually. So you see I've disconnected it. We are going to add it to the inventory right here, but not where it previously was added. We have to do some other things first. So I'm going to get rid of this add to inventory entirely. Now, I do have a special case here. Again, you don't have to follow this logic, but I do have two different types of inventory that we've been supporting in the series. So I've been supporting our items static, true, and false. And so what this means is if they are static, basically every time you get rid of something in your inventory or put it away, it's destroyed. And then when you recreate it or pull it out of your inventory, it gets spawned again. This is better for performance, but you can't really change things on these items very easily. And if it's false, it's worse on performance, but it allows you full customization of your weapons. They're, you know, if they have durabilities or modifiers to them. And so I support both these. You don't have to support both these. But if you already had this game mode ref in here, checking if it's valid, grabbing the items that's static, destroy actor, all this stuff's still good. Okay, I'm just going to move it over since I got rid of the add to inventory function call right here. Now we have this really ugly set of logic, but it's only ugly because the way I'm trying to put it in right now. When we can actually delete stuff, it'll be cleaned up real quick. But I want to show you what we had and then what we went to. All right. Get rid of those. Those are just random nodes that aren't supposed to be there. Okay. So none of this has changed. So I'm going to leave this alone. However, in my false, are item stats static? So if my item stats are not static, again, this is where they're more customizable. This is where I can add modifiers to them, that sort of thing. If that's the case, and that's what we're working on right now, then there's a little bit more we have to do. Because for those, we weren't destroying them. We were actually just setting them to be invisible and hiding their collision for now. Don't worry. There's more we're going to do with this in the future for performance. But for now, this is actually okay because we haven't gotten into a lot of the stuff that we're going to need for some of the more advanced stuff. Regardless, we will have to still set them to be invisible and hide their collision because we don't want them to have collision when they're not actually in the character's hand. So while we're doing this, we only want to do these things if this is truly the item that we care about. Okay? Because if it's not, and remember we removed the add to inventory here. If it's not the item that we already have attached, we want to make sure we add it to our inventory. But if it is, we don't want to do it. So we got to be careful here, all right? So this is what we had before. We had item type, which comes from default item. Item type is an enum that determines if it's item. So like consumable, weapon, equipment, and other, which I haven't done anything for, but probably like quest items or miscellaneous. And what we do here is we were going into the proper cast. So if it's item, it goes into cast to base item BP, weapon goes to base weapon BP, equipment goes to base equipment BP. Then we were grabbing the static mesh off of each of these. So base item BP is static mesh, weapon BP is weapon mesh, base equipment BP is equipment static mesh. Okay, but they're all the same. These are all the static meshes on these guys. And I was setting their visibility to be hidden and allowing it to continue to all children for all three of these cases. Then I was disabling collision, setting it to no collision. And I was setting that on the interaction box specifically. The interaction box is basically the box that is surrounding the object. This is where we are considered overlapping with it. So it's not a one-to-one, it's just a square. If we're in a general area in relation to that item, we are overlapping with it. All right, and so this is what we had before, but we're going to basically take this and upgrade it, okay? I'm going to just delete it because I have the other one here, but you can keep yours and upgrade it to what I'm about to show you. So let me bring this down here so this is not so ugly. And then we'll clean up the reroute nodes and stuff. Actually, I'll clean this up now for you just so it's not in the way. I'll just put it up here. We'll clean it up better in a second. But this way it's not in the way while we're going over this logic. Okay. So now let's take a look at this upgraded logic. So if it's an item, we still cast the base item BP, weapon still cast the base weapon BP, equipment still cast the base equipment BP. All that is still good, all the same way we had it. And each of these still grabs the respective static mesh and interaction box. Base item, static mesh, interaction box, base weapon, weapon mesh, interaction box, base equipment, equipment static mesh, and interaction box. But there's something else I'm doing now. And so what this is going to be is we're going to check the collision settings of the interaction box to see if they're valid before adding it to the inventory. There's a reason for this. Remember, our item, we go to our base item BP and look at our interaction box. If I scroll down, it's on overlap all dynamic by default. And so in this case, it's query only. It has no physics collision, which is good because it's an overlap. It doesn't really need physics collision. With this in mind, this means that when this is enabled, if we walk into this, we trigger the overlap. However, we do have logic set up that disables collision when we add it to the inventory, as I was just showing you here. In which case, once the collision has been disabled, we don't want to add it to the inventory again. In fact, we'd rather skip it altogether. So, what I've done is I've grabbed the collision settings on the interaction box, and then determined if we should add it to inventory. Okay, so I grab off the interaction box, drag off of this, and type get collision enabled. Alright, and this isn't a boolean like some other collision enabled. This returns the enum of the collision type. Alright. Then you drag off this return value, and you can do a switch statement on it. You could also do an equal equal off the enum and select the specific type. I did a switch statement and included everything but no collision. However, really, I only need whatever I'm setting it to and whatever the default value is for this interaction box. So, in the case of our settings in base item BP interaction box, I have it set to query only. No physics collision. So the only one I really need to bring from is this. I don't need to drag from the other two into here. But the point I'm making is that anything that's not no collision, since I know that's when it's disabled, is allowed to add this to the inventory. So if the collision settings on this interaction box aren't no collision, now we call add to inventory, and we pass the item from the cast. From there, we then set the visibility to no visibility and propagate the children on the static mesh. And then we disable the collision on the interaction box. Okay. Right now it's just going to a reroute node so we can go and break the for loop. I'll explain this in a second. Let's go over the weapon and the equipment. Okay. So our base weapon is the same deal. In fact, it's basically the exact same deal, just we have to use the weapon mesh in the interaction box that the base weapon has. So we get collision enabled off the interaction box, bring it into a switch statement. If it's anything other than no collision, we add it to the inventory. Then we grab the weapon mesh and set its visibility to false and propagate to children. Then we grab the interaction box, set collision enabled to no collision. Also goes to a reroute node up here that's going to break the for loop. Lastly, if it's equipment, cast the base equipment BP, grab our static mesh and interaction box, off the interaction box, get collision enabled, do a switch on this. If it's anything other than no collision, add it to the inventory. Grab the equipment static mesh, set its visibility to be invisible, and allow it to propagate to children. Lastly, grab the interaction box and set the collision enabled to no collision, then bring it to a reroute node over here. Now, we can clean this up however we want. Breaks in blueprints and for loops are honestly pretty ugly most of the time. So I will do my best here to make this look somewhat nice. I think that's straight. Pretty close to it. There we go. And let's see here, we can do this. There we go. And now you can see they all go up to this reroute node. And the reroute node goes into the break section of the for each loop with break. Now let me explain why this is. So a for each loop, as you probably know, will go through each item that we pass it. So we pass it this array, say we're overlapping 3 items. It's going to go through each item, determine the logic it needs to do. And then once it's done with all the code in the loop body, it'll go to the next. It'll increment the index, go to the next element, and then start loop body again. If we break it, it's going to stop the for each loop and go to the completed. The reason we want to break after an add to inventory, if we're overlapping multiple items at the same time, it's going to just keep going through the logic. So even though we've already added to inventory, we're going to add, say, 2, 3, 4, 10 items if we're overlapping 10 items. Like, think of something like Borderlands. You kill a boss and a bunch of loot drops. Imagine if every single item that you were overlapping with automatically just got added to your inventory when you pressed it one time. Now, they do interaction a little bit differently. So when you look at an object, there's a raycast that's performed, and if that raycast hits a designated area, that's when you can add it to inventory. We will be covering that too. But overlapping is a viable method. But if we do it, we just have to make sure that we're not doing it multiple times or for the wrong actors. Okay? That's why we want to break it after a successful add to inventory. Now, I don't do anything after completed right now, but for the future, and we'll cover this in the next episode, but in case you're curious about this, when we are overlapping multiple items at a time, right now we have that little bug where we have multiple pieces of text on top of each other. If I am to equip one, it is going to say we are no longer overlapping an item, and it is going to get rid of both text, because in base item BP, when we end overlap with a certain item, we disable is overlapping item, and then we get all widgets of equip item and remove it. This is a bad practice for when we can overlap multiple items at the same time. So like I said, we'll be fixing that and covering that. But just so you know, if you want to fix that, you got to look in your on-component end overlap for base item BP, base weapon BP, base equipment BP, and also change your is overlapping item logic. Alright, now with this in, this is looking good for our item stat static false, which has been updated now. There's another thing I'd like to do. Is overlapping item. So we talked about this before, and is overlapping item basically just determines if the character is overlapping an item. Well, the way it's decided is pretty bad, because right now it's working for a 1 overlap maximum system. So whenever any overlap ends, we set it to false, but that's not a good way to do it. I'm not going to be covering the multiple overlap today, but you'll see how we can fix that in the next episode. With that in mind, we don't need to be checking if we're overlapping item before we go into this logic anymore. Remember why I said we needed this in the first place. This is because if we were trying to use index 0 off of this array, it wouldn't exist because the array was empty. It had no indices in it. However, since we're doing a for each loop, if nothing is returned from this array, it's going to loop through nothing, no array elements, and thus it won't give us an error. So we actually don't need this boolean or the branch anymore. So now I can do this, remove that boolean, bring it over here, and here we go. Alright. We can leave the is overlapping item boolean in the game, because we will probably want to know if we are overlapping items or not. For example, we can use it to determine if we should pop up a widget with how many items we're overlapping and their details. Just making sure everything is functioning as intended. You play around with it, make sure you can do everything you'd expect to be able to do, and then it all looks good. You can see that I can. So you can safely remove that. You can keep all the sets of it, and you can keep the variable in the code and all that, but we don't need it to be checked during the interaction anymore. This will actually save us from running into some issues as well, because it would stop us from some of the logic that we had wanted to do. Let's go into our game mode real quick. Our item stat static false is fully working. Let's enable it. So I walk in here, I pick up my sword, and there's nothing in my inventory. Why is that? Well, that's because remember we removed the add to inventory function? We add that call. Don't worry about these errors. These are in relation to the icons on the minimap, which will be fixed in the next minimap episode. So in our base character BP, if we go back into it, we have our item stat static now is true. Well, now we never go into any of this logic about adding to inventory. So we actually want to call our add to inventory function before we destroy the actor that is in the world. So with this in mind, we still need to do this logic to make sure we're adding only the items that we want to our inventory, even if item stats are static. So you know what that means. That means we can actually get rid of this logic here. Okay, we can disconnect it. We're still going to want to use it. Let's move it up here because we'll use it. And let's attach default item where it should go. It should not automatically go to destroy actor. Instead, it should go here to the switch statement. Alright. Now I'm actually going to clean this up even more by moving this up and out for now. We'll come back to that in a second. And let's get rid of this reroute node and instead move our logic where we want it. Okay. So you see I'm taking everything, I'm moving it up here. Alright. And now this actually looks good. Let's do that. And let's clean this up even more because we really just don't need everything the way that it was set up here. Okay. Get rid of these old reroute nodes. Again, not necessary for where they're at. There we go. And now this is looking a lot better. So what we have is we have our get overlapping actors. We go into a for each loop. We go to default item, which then goes into a switch statement, which then goes into our standard switch logic. Okay, so we have base item BP, base weapon BP, base equipment BP. Now they all go through and they break the for loop. However, now there's something else we need to do before we do that. Okay, this logic that we add here. If item stats are static, we should go ahead and make the logic run through here for all these cases. All right, so the way I'm going to do this is at the end of all three of these, the item, weapon, and equipment, attach it to the logic we had in here. All right. Something like that. If they are static, we want to destroy the actor, and we can actually pass it the default item if you don't want to drag off of the base item BP, base weapon BP, base equipment BP, and make a different one every time. You can actually drag off the default item here. So something like this, if you were to make another reroute node. Whoops, if I could type. And come over here, make another reroute node. And then pass this into destroy actor. Okay. Alright, so now we have default item goes to reroute node down here, which comes to this destroy actor at the very end. This is called off all three of these guys. If the game mode reference is valid and our item stat static is true, then we go ahead and destroy the actor. This will work because add to inventory has now already been called, regardless if the stats are static or not. We don't have that logic in here anymore. But we still have to destroy the one in the world after equipping something. So I'd say if the game mode reference is not valid, you can go ahead and go to the reroute node. However, if it's not valid, you probably have bigger problems anyway, so it's up to you if you want to do that. We'll allow that for now. But the main part is the destroy actor definitely has to go back here, because we still want to break out the for loop after this as well. All right, so this is what it looks like now. These are going to the break in the for each. And now if I come into the game and I equip an item, say I go over to another item like a helmet, I can select it and you can see that the helmet is in the inventory. And same with the chest plate. And this works for everything now. Okay. So now this works for both cases. Again, ignore these errors. These are fixed in the next minimap episode. So you can leave your R item stat static on or off depending on what version of the inventory you are using. But there you go. Now this method works for both. Now what we should do is go ahead and clean up this interact input action event, because actually I'd like this to be a code event like a lot of our other input actions are. So we actually made, if we go to a third person tutorial character CPP in the code, in setup player input component, we have a binding for the interact action that calls an interact function in the third person tutorial character. I actually set this up quite a long time ago. And it prints a log if there's an overlapped item. And says we picked up an item. Well, there's a few things I want to change. First of all, I don't want to only be able to interact if we're overlapping an item anymore. We're changing that so that we can overlap multiple items and we can still use interact. It just won't do anything if we're not overlapping an item. Stuff like that. So I'm actually going to get rid of the logic that we set up in here. Forget that. But before I even compile this, if you look in the output log, even if I was overlapping an item and I pressed interact, it's not going to print that. See that? It didn't print anything. And those conditions would have been met at that point. That's because if you have a blueprint character, or really any blueprint or any child of that class that's overriding that input action, this code one is not going to be called. The child is going to be called. So the blueprint here is going to get its interaction. It's actually overriding the parent binding. So if I uncheck override parent binding, go ahead, compile this, then you can see we picked up an item, fires. However, instead of doing that, I mean that works well and that's fine, but just to follow along with the way we've done the rest of the series so far, I recommend that we just make an interact blueprint function. So we type in interact in our third-person tutorial character.h file. Interact. We only have one result, which is the standard interact function. And this is good. We can do interact logic in the code, and we definitely will be. But it's okay if we still want to do some more interaction logic in the blueprint. I'm not going to change all that right now. So instead, what I'd like to do is add a blueprint in interact BP. So basically, let's say interact with something like this. Interact the world using blueprint data, or we can say trigger blueprint logic for interaction, I think is more accurate. And we'll have to make sure that we make this a U function that is blueprint implementable event, like this. And then we'll give it a name, which is void interact BP. And so we can have our interact logic here in the code, and we can also have the blueprint version. And what interact in the code should do now, if we go to the CPP file, go to the interact function, we just call this interact BP. Okay, and if we want, just to, so it's really clear what's going on here, perform blueprint logic for interaction. All right, so we can still do other stuff in the code. Like I keep saying, it's not overriding that. All right. And now we can stop the editor, we can relaunch, and I'll catch up with you when the editor is back open. All right, the editor is back open, and now if I go back to my base character BP, you'll see I have my input action interact. I can get rid of this, and I can instead have my interact BP event in this character, which then goes to the for each loop with break instead. And now what will happen is if we see our interaction working, which it does, we know that this is working because what's happening is the code function is being called and then performing the logic in the code. So it's doing the interact BP function call, which is right here now. It has taken over the standard interact input action event. This is just to make the code a little bit more consistent and the project a little bit more consistent because we don't typically use the input actions as events in the blueprint, but rather set them up in the code. There is technically one exception to this still, which is the open the inventory menu. We should do the same thing here, just to really make it so it's consistent as possible. It's up to you if you want to do it now. I'm going to do a bunch more inventory updates before we're done with the inventory system, so I'll include it in another episode. Next time we edit the inventory menu directly, we'll go ahead and fix that up. But there you go, guys. So now we are able to overlap multiple items at the same time and still equip one properly. We can have items equipped and equip others, or excuse me, interact with others. Alright, one other thing worth noting, after removing is overlapping item, it will go ahead and fix up what I mentioned earlier, where you could not interact with both of these. So see how I'm overlapping both? If I interact one time, I pick up both of these items, which could be good, you could want that. But typically you'd only like to pick up one or the other, and that is why we need to support multiple overlaps at a time, that way you're not getting like 10 in a row. However, for now it's fine, play around with it, see if you like it or not. And we'll have a solution to decide which one we want to equip and interact with in the next episode for that. That's all I got though, guys, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership subscribers and Patreon supporters. Thank you for all you do and for all the extra support you guys have given. I really appreciate it. It really assists me more than you probably know, so thank you so much for that. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. Be happy to help you out and get you sorted. Like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.